All
Good
right,
afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Ala McCoy. I'm Director of Startup Support at University of Maryland Dion Ventures, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who joined us today at the next installment of Startup Fundamentals Workshop Series, both live webinar audience and those watching a recorded session on our Startup EMD YouTube channel. This workshop series is offered by UM Ventures with close collaboration from MTech at the Clark School of Engineering and Ningman Center for Entrepreneurship at the Smith School of Business. To everyone attending the live session, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function. You can find it at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will address those questions at the end of the presentations, but please keep submitting them throughout as soon as you think of them. This session is recorded, will be posted on our Startup UMD YouTube channel. So if you would like to, you can submit your questions anonymously. So today's session is focused on a very interesting and very important topic of creating a sustainable business model for nonprofit companies. And our speaker, Audrey Mickahail, is the Senior Vice President of Opportunity at Work. She has a lot of experience in doing just that. We're very lucky to have her here. Thank you so much, Audrey, for joining us today. I am going to let you take over the session. My mic is off, my camera is off, and you can talk a little bit more about your background and then dive into the session. Again, thank you so much.
thank you, Ala. It's so great to be here with everyone. Hello, as Ala mentioned, my name is Audrey Mickahail. I am the Senior Vice President of what we call Private Sector and Membership Experience at Opportunity at Work. Opportunity at Work is a workforce development nonprofit based in DC, so I am local to those of you who are in and around the College Park area. But hopefully this is useful far beyond just the DMV and the Beltway uh, region. So I'm so excited to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts here with you today. I am going to do a few things in our time together, and I'd say a little under an hour at this point. I do feel like I should just share that most of this really comes from the experience I've had working for a couple of nonprofits in the past few years in the workforce development space, and previous to that for a membership, professional membership association earlier in my career. But I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a CPA. This should not be construed as either legal or financial advice. We're going to talk a little bit about a range of subjects that I hope will contribute to what is really the fabric of sustainability for nonprofits. But it's going to be a fairly high-level overview. You absolutely can have these slides if they're useful to you. I did include a bunch of links and resources and references that I used in building this presentation. And obviously, I'm more than happy to answer questions if you reach out to me after the session. I'm going to share a little bit just to get us started about Opportunity at Work. Obviously, this is the organization I work for currently. I am speaking here today in a capacity as a leader of the organization, but in my own experience rather than representing the views of Opportunity at Work writ large. It's been an amazing journey that I've had over the past 2.5 years. And I do want to talk a little bit about some of the funding that we've experienced as an organization, the kind of ups and downs, the interesting backstories for some of the funding that we've received. And I'm actually really proud of the accomplishments of this organization. We have, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, most of our funding today comes from philanthropic sources, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Yield Giving, which is Mackenzie Scott's organization, Aphorism, which is Reid Hoffman's organization, and others. But as you would expect in a presentation entitled Business Model Sustainability Considerations for Nonprofits, those are not our only sources of funding. And I'll share a little bit about the journey that we're currently on to, frankly, diversify and to create resilience for this organization. All right, so stepping back a little bit from the experience of Opportunity at Work, I want to talk more broadly about why you might be listening to this presentation, why you might be here today. the work of nonprofits is fundamentally about identifying a market failure. The choice to go the nonprofit route versus the for-profit route is an important one, but it is one that I think if you are thinking about launching, or you're currently running or working for a nonprofit, fundamental to that decision is the need to address something that the free market is not addressing. So let's talk a little bit about what those things can be. So I would submit to you that we are here fundamentally to identify, address, and ultimately to counter market failures. And, this is fairly common economics 101 stuff, but I did want to start here because I think, as you'll see throughout the time that we have together today, running a sustainable and effective nonprofit is a tricky business. But if there isn't fundamentally that tension that you're managing between both the funding side and the genuine and core purpose of your organization, that's both the trick of running a nonprofit or working for a nonprofit and its essential purpose. So let's start at the 12 o'clock position and talk a little bit about what some of the causes of market failure can be. One is public goods. So, for example, examples of public goods can be things like national defense or public parks or street lighting. When we talk about public goods, one of the things that we hear often, you may have heard the phrase, the tragedy of the commons. So in launching and in running nonprofits, often one of the ways in which nonprofits can be uniquely valuable in the world is to take care of those things that are public goods and that promote this counter to the tragedy of the commons. Another market failure cause can be something like a monopoly or simply businesses with very high barriers to entry. So in a competitive landscape, you might really struggle if you were trying to counter a monopoly, but a nonprofit gives you a opportunity to work against those market dynamics, but in a way that takes a little bit of the pressure off, and where other actors like philanthropies or government might have a real interest in creating a counterbalance to that market power. So moving to the 6 o'clock position, externalities. These are the most common example of externalities are things like pollution. So a enterprise, a for-profit enterprise may cause externalities or outcomes that affect your not only the folks who are directly engaged in that particular activity, but potentially have ripple effects for folks who have absolutely nothing to do with the activity of a particular market. So, pollution is an excellent example of that. And then finally, at the 9 o'clock position, incomplete information. So this can be either asymmetrical information where one party has a great deal more information than the other. Typically, the seller has more than the buyer. Or it may be a situation in which actually both sides are suffering from incomplete information. All right, that's enough about that. I just wanted to lay some groundwork about, I think, one of the things that defines the essence of what it means to be a nonprofit. From here, I want to share one challenge, and I alluded to this a moment ago, this idea of the tension that exists when you are working in a nonprofit space. And that is what's called the sustainability paradox. And this is the idea that nonprofits are meant to solve market failures where, by definition, the free market is not going to respond efficiently or effectively. But at the same time, even without those market, tailwinds, if you will, folks do want them to be self-sustaining from the very beginning. Even your funders are going to look to you for, what are your opportunities to scale, to grow, to increase your financial stability. And I will say this as someone who is responsible for one of our main customer segments at Opportunity at Work. I sort of hate the word scale. It's a personal pet peeve of mine, but it is a pretty unavoidable topic. And I do think that that is one of the areas of tension that as leaders in this space, we need to think through and be prepared to both anchor our stakeholders in and be prepared to respond to. So wanted to share that as just one of the kind of profound tensions that exists in this space. Coming up next, I wanted to share a little bit more about Opportunity at Work, the organization I work for, as a means of, frankly, talking a little bit about a case in point, about how we address market failures and how we think about our mission in respect to that. Okay, so I'm going to try to play this video and I hope that you can hear it. It is just 1 minute long, but this is a really good introduction to our mission as an organization. Let's hope it works.
Most hiring algorithms would scream me out.
Some bosses couldn't see me as a leader.
I've run this place for 20 years, but I still need to prove that I'm more than what you see on paper.
What I do, it's second nature for me, coordinating 100 details at once.
The way my mind works, I have a very mechanical brain.
I sold them on my skills.
Gotta be some kind of mechanical brain.
My magic is
Analytics and empathy. That's how I'm getting clients. You've got the confidence here to show up and just out of this. I am more than quite a favor.
I never got a college degree. Today, I'm the CEO of my own company. People want to tell me I'm one in a million, when actually I'm one of millions. Stars are all around us. It's time for them to shine.
Most hiring algorithms would
All right, well, I hope you were able to hear that well, but that is an advertisement that was designed, and we have partnered with the Ad Council to run this multi-year advertising campaign nationally that we call Tear the Paper Ceiling. And the intention of that ad campaign is to bring awareness to the experience of individuals that we call stars, those who are skilled through alternative routes rather than a bachelor's degree, and how they experience the American labor market. So hopefully that was a really compelling and resonant introduction to the work that we do. And we pair that with real data. So what you just experienced was the narrative, the storytelling, the emotional appeal of trying to influence the American labor market to nudge in a different direction. But fundamentally, the market failure that we're addressing is the last one that I mentioned to you on that slide 2 slides ago, which is that incomplete information. And in this case, that information that's incomplete, I think, exists on both sides, both on the side of hiring managers as well as on the side of workers. And this chart here, I won't spend too much time here, but I do think it's an interesting point to illustrate our mission and the purpose, the reason we exist, is to address this notion of incomplete information. And what you're seeing on this slide, these 2 lines represent 2 different populations. We studied this cohort of workers. The blue line represents those individuals with a bachelor's degree, and the purple line represents those without a bachelor's degree, the folks we call stars. And we tracked this cohort of workers over 30 years, starting in 1989, when they were roughly 25 years old, over the coming 30 years of their careers. And what we found was that when they started their careers, that the beginning of that line on the left-hand side of the slide, there was a pretty big gap between those individuals who have a bachelor's degree and those who don't. And that's not unusual, and that's kind of the way it's always been. But as we track this population over time, what we found is that stars never catch up. They never catch up to workers with bachelor's degrees in terms of their earnings. And the upshot of this, what it means, is that the labor market is effectively valuing stars, or rather valuing a bachelor's degree as being equivalent to 30 years of work experience. And that is clearly a market failing. What it says is that stars don't get paid for the skills that they develop over the course of their careers in the way that folks with bachelor's degrees do. And so we see this as a market failing. We see this as an example of incomplete information. And it's one of the things that we have been working for the past several years to account for and to correct. So hopefully that was a useful example of a way in which a market failure can be countered by a nonprofit. All right. So the next section is really about designing your business model. And again, I'm going to start at a fairly high level here, and then we will dig in particularly onto the revenue side, because I think there are real trade-offs to be made in addition to considering the cost side as well. All right. Hopefully, you're all on this call because you're seasoned business leaders and have a lot of experience with at least understanding business model design. If you have ever seen the book Business Model Generation, which is a great, very usable handbook for business leaders of all sorts, this version, and I've linked it here in the title, this version is meant to be an adaptation for nonprofits. So that green table that you see in the middle is really directly kind of draws from the core business model canvas, but makes some adjustments in order to be able to really home in on those things that are unique to a nonprofit business model. And my small and modest additions to this slide are meant to help folks see, there's inputs that you have kind of coming into the business, and ultimately what that's leading to is impact. And I think that's, it's important to point that out because the numbering on the slide really starts from the right-hand side and moves largely to the left. The intention there is to identify that prioritization and that sequencing of considerations, starting with your beneficiaries or your segments. So what are you focusing on as a nonprofit, whether that's a particular population or a particular cause? Really homing in on that, understanding that very deeply, and then flowing the rest of the business model ideation approach from there. So I won't spend too terribly much time on this slide. I just think it's a really helpful anchoring for folks to get a sense for, like, what does it mean to establish a holistic business model, and how do we adapt that to the needs of nonprofits? There are a couple of things I do want to just highlight for you because they'll come up over and over again as uniquely useful, I think, to folks who are in a position of either starting or managing or evolving nonprofits. There's quite a bit of importance, I think, to a few of these categories. The one I'll call out first is key partners. One of the things we're going to talk about throughout our time together is the importance of recognizing, and this is frankly a lesson I feel like I've had to learn quite frequently or repeatedly, is, when you're in a nonprofit, you may not be you and your staff and your team may not have to do all of the things yourself. There are ways in which you can use the advantage of being in a nonprofit organization to draw in, to encourage, and to really create what our CEO calls magnetism for folks to come and help you. And I think nonprofits are uniquely positioned to tap into resources through partnerships that for-profits may not have the same sort of opportunity to take advantage of. And there are a couple of examples that I'll share with you as we go through. And then, on the bottom, this is where I think we'll spend the bulk of our time together, talking both about funding streams and about cost structure. And these are all real trade-offs and decisions that as a nonprofit leader, you'll need to make, and that will likely evolve over time. And this is really a key point. How you get started, what you sequence in terms of your strategies and your tactics for managing your business will really, or your nonprofit rather, will really matter, and will be an essential sort of foundation as you consider your evolution over time, as you evolve to the needs of your particular mission, and frankly, as hopefully you have wild success and are able to evolve that mission over time. All right. So next we're going to get into some of the details. And I wanted to really start here with the varying sources of funding and revenue. And when Ala and I talked about this session, one of the things that I think came out really clearly for me was the need to share with folks that you really do have a wide variety of options from a funding perspective, but there are real trade-offs. And when you think about sustainability as a real need and opportunity, a big part of that is balancing both the resilience that you might get from having multiple funding streams with the overhead and expertise and frankly complexity that that variability or that diversity might introduce to your organization. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I'll start from the left-hand side, and you know, it's not one I see a lot, but merchandise is one option. I actually read an article recently, and like it was titled something to the effect of "Should your nonprofit sell T-shirts?" You know, that's certainly an option. It's one I don't see in the spaces I have been a part of terribly frequently, but you know, for the sake of completeness, I thought it was an interesting example to offer. Moving over to the right now and just going left to right in sequence, events. I did work for, as I mentioned, a membership association earlier in my career. And in that case, the association made a very significant proportion of its revenue each year from its annual conference. It was the place where professionals in this field gathered on an annual basis. It was very well attended. It was well run. And events was actually a very, very significant revenue source. So if under the right circumstances, that can be a tremendous boon to the organization, depending on your mission and your audience. And in fact, as a professional member association, it was a great way to talk about changes in professional practice, networking, and it just made a ton of sense in that context. There are other kinds of events, of course. There can be things like galas or, you know, auctions, marathons. A lot of small nonprofits will often host things like gala dinners or silent auctions as fundraisers. And that can be depending, again, on your mission and your audience and how geographically dispersed your stakeholders are. It could be a really powerful way to supplement or drive, actually, funding. Moving to the third category, fee-for-service and membership. And I've worked in both. And this is actually one of the areas where we are expanding our mission as an organization. So let me take them in turn. In the case of fee-for-service, this can be a really great way to raise not just building your mission and helping instantiate your mission within stakeholder organizations, within client organizations, but it can actually be a relatively flexible means of getting funding relative to things like grants, and I'll get into that in a moment. In my last job, not here at Opportunity at Work, my role was largely to take over and grow what was essentially a corporate consulting practice within a workforce development nonprofit. I had, depending on your perspective, the good fortune or the misfortune of joining and starting that work in 2020. What was fascinating about that was it was actually not a hard time, as you recall, not a hard time to raise funding through a fee-for-service model or through a grant model at that time because of the reckoning that this country was going through. And so there were lots of checks being written, but the downside of that and the thing to keep in mind is that that was a moment in time, and there can be a ton of variability in fundraising and in the development of your business. So we saw incredible growth in that year because we did work that was focused on social impact, and there was a lot of interest and a lot of appetite for that work at that time. But that, you know, if you're not getting multi-year contracts or grants, it can be difficult to sustain that. So just a caution for you there. From a membership perspective, that's actually a really interesting and I think opportune way to think about sustainability. And it is something that, you know, I was actually hired here to help implement. membership models are pretty stable. You get a fairly predictable revenue stream. You can, rely on that as long as you're at least maintaining, if not growing, your membership. And so we've been developing that model here at Opportunity at Work over time, and really intend to go pretty deeply into that model across the coming months and years. So again, from a sustainability perspective, can give you the benefit of and the advantage of having a relatively stable way of countering the variability and the ups and downs of things like grants. Moving on to corporate sponsorships. This is a really interesting area where not only can you get financial sponsorship from corporations, but also in many cases in-kind donations, which can be incredibly valuable, whether that is technology or professional services or partnership opportunities that connect you with folks. There's a lot that can fall under this bucket of funding, if you will, and I sort of put air quotes around that. So again, can be financial or non-financial, and would encourage you to think creatively about what corporate sponsorship can provide your organization. The thing I will note from some experience, frankly, is that, and this is true, I think, for a lot of these sources of funding, you do have to be prepared to resource and invest in managing those relationships. And that is not a trivial amount of work. I think that's true for grants as well. But something to think about as you consider your mix of funding sources is to really think about the capacity that you have for really cultivating and managing relationships on an ongoing basis. And in particular, when you're getting something like an in-kind donation from a corporate sponsor, what is your organization's ability to absorb that donation or absorb that offering? That's a really key consideration to be aware of. Sometimes you may find a better answer is not yes. It may be maybe not a no, but a not now. So be really aware of, and frankly, honest with yourself about how much support and what kinds of support your organization is prepared to absorb. Moving on to grants, these come in a wide variety of flavors. They come from government, certainly corporate foundations, and non-corporate foundations, and that can be a tremendous source of benefit and opportunity. But again, one of those things where there are strings attached, and certainly depending on the funder, your ability to partner, absorb, and in our case, what we find is there's a real need for us to take that data, an example of which I just showed you, evolve our insight and our research. And that requires a fair amount of relationship management at a fairly high and sophisticated level to ensure our partners understand the insights that we're generating, the research that we're doing, the stories that we're telling in order to shift outcomes for stars. It takes time, it takes effort, and often it takes time and effort and commitment from quite senior people in the organization. So again, not for the faint of heart. And then finally, I'll end on individual donations. This can be can have the benefit of both providing a ongoing base of funding. It can be relatively straightforward from a relationship management perspective. There are means like having a corporate match if you go through some of the platforms that enable individual giving through as a benefit of employment in certain firms. I know when I was in the private sector, one of the companies I worked for had one of these platforms, and they did do corporate match. So that's something to consider. May not be the only, and certainly not deeply within your control, but certainly something to consider as a potential, if nothing else, supplement. So with all of that, and went through a little bit of detail on that point, I want to move us forward and just share again, as a case in point, a example from my current organization, Opportunity at Work, and the organization I worked for previously, which is called JFF, or Jobs for the Future. These are two organizations that both work in workforce, that both have similar theories of change and missions to support economic mobility for workers, learners and workers in this country. But they have chosen different paths, or they have different mixes of funding sources, and they're somewhat different sizes as well. So, and these are pretty rough numbers, just to give you a sense of like order of magnitude. But I'll walk through a couple of examples here. Both organizations do accept grants from a variety of sources. I put individual donations as a slightly lighter green, and the reason for that is actually that I was thinking about it from the perspective of like, when does someone's individual giving actually start to look a little bit like a grant? So not a ton of activity in this space, but we do have funders in both my current organization and previously who may have been, wealthy individuals and are either operating as individuals or in certain cases through a family foundation or a family office. So for me, that sort of blurred the line a little bit between individual and foundation, a large foundation like a Kellogg or a Ford Foundation. On the event side, JFF actually has one of the premier workforce events on an annual basis. They both take corporate sponsorship, and they also charge individuals for attending. So wanted to share that contrast between Opportunity at Work and JFF. Neither one that I know of sells merchandise, but certainly do both have a variety of other funding sources and ways of working with corporate sponsors. And again, just reinforcing the point from the last slide, those corporate sponsorship opportunities can come in the form of financial and non-financial support. Just to share one example from Opportunity at Work, we were part of one of Google's AI accelerators this year, and that was a really robust support from Google to help us develop our technology, our data infused technology with generative AI. So one of the amazing opportunities that came out of the selection to be part of that accelerator wasn't just financial support, it was actually the opportunity for our product team to engage on a very regular basis with Google engineers. And honestly, I don't know that you could put a price tag on that, or if you did, it would be huge. What it gave us as a small nonprofit was the ability to learn alongside some of the leaders in this field, to accelerate our learning as an organization, to say nothing of the actual product development, technology development that we enjoyed. So that was a roughly 9-month accelerator that we participated in that ended actually just last month in a demo day, and has then opened up a whole bunch more opportunities for us to think about how to keep pushing. So wanted to share that as a example of ways in which corporate sponsorships can be creative, can bring a variety of different resources, and keeping yourself open to those opportunities can be really groundbreaking. But make no mistake, while I think it was an incredible honor and absolutely one of our big wins this year was to be part of that accelerator, it did mean that providing the capacity and having the team be ready to deeply engage and deeply partner with the Google team required some choices on our part. So I would just share that, like, absolutely not regrettable, would do it again in a heartbeat, but it's not without trade-offs. It did mean that we as an organization, again, with 80-ish full-time employees, really needed to make choices about our own roadmap and the variety of things we could do and the things that actually we had to hit pause on. So all to say, those are hopefully great opportunities and great choices to be able to make. But it's incredibly important when you think about sustainability of your organization. We've largely been talking about that. as a matter of financial sustainability, but the sustainability of your workforce and the humans involved and their burnout is very real. And so I think one of my lessons and takeaways, both for myself and hopefully for you, is to be really judicious and pragmatic about how much you can take on at any given time. And what does it mean to be sustainable from a financial perspective is really, really key, but it's not the only consideration. All right, so from here, I want to get into some deeper pros and cons for some of the options of, especially on the funding side. I'm going to spend more time there than on the cost side, because I really do think that is a much more individualized conversation and set of trade-offs. It really depends on the capabilities of your organization, what you're trying to do. But hopefully there's some good generalizable ideas on the funding side that we can talk about. All right, so starting with grants, and I know the coming slides are going to have a little bit more text than I would normally like, but my hope is that there's going to be some sort of take-home value, if you will, of some of these slides, just pulling this information into one place. So bear with me while I go through, at a high level at least, some of the pros and cons of grant funding. You know, I alluded to this a little bit, and I won't go through every bullet, but one of the pros is not just that you can actually receive pretty substantial funding. We've gotten, again, for an organization of our size, we've been really honored and delighted to have folks really invest in us in very meaningful and substantive ways, which has then given us the opportunity to run at building capabilities, building technology, developing data assets that didn't necessarily have a very quick, classical return on investment. But when you are working with folks who are grant funding, particularly philanthropic funding, and particularly those very progressive, very risk-taking and ambitious philanthropies, one of the things that can happen if you play your cards right is you can be given quite a runway to run at very hard problems. And hopefully it won't come as any surprise to anyone on this call who heard the beginning of my pitch about opportunity at work and about stars and the market failing that we're trying to address. We're running at a really hard problem that has persisted in the labor market and has gotten worse over the last 20 years. That's not something that's going to have a quick ROI or even, be subject to a whole bunch of low-hanging fruit. We're really trying to, what we call, rewire the labor market, change systems at a fundamental level, change the incentives for employers to consider what it means to hire or require a bachelor's degree for jobs that don't necessarily need it. And to frankly hold up a mirror to employers about what has been happening in the labor market. That's actually a product of a lot of unintended consequences. So our in many cases, most important and longest standing partners are folks who've given us really substantial funding to be able to run at those problems in a meaningful way, rather than if you were talking about selling a solution or selling a membership or running a bake sale or something like that. So one of the key considerations I would put forth to you is to just think about what is the nature of the mission that you're trying to address, over what time horizon, and what does deep partnership look like. The other side of that coin is that, as I mentioned, it often takes a long, long time to bring those funders into your pipeline, to convince them of your theory of change, that you have not just a theory of what the world should look like and how to get there, but that you have the capabilities to be able to do that work effectively. So all of that takes time, takes credibility, takes real commitment, takes rigor. And I would say that, there's definitely overhead there. There's definitely time investment that's really required to manage those relationships and to invest in and bring people along with you. The other thing I would say about grants is that, and this is, I think, really key as well, many of them have pretty significant reporting requirements. I think one of the reasons folks have been really interested in Mackenzie Scott's giving is that it's been unrestricted, which is it's really a gift, but it's also a sea change in a lot of ways, for how traditional funders think about governance and think about, overseeing their grantees. So sometimes, again, very strict reporting requirements. And the other thing I would say is, like, you, strictly speaking, can't really make a profit off grants. You're typically required to use that funding for a very specific work scope. And if you don't use it for that work scope, at a minimum, you need to go back to the funder and ask if there's flexibility. And in other cases, there may actually be a need to give back that funding. So it is a somewhat less flexible, although, trends are changing there. Individual donations, I won't spend a lot of time here. I did talk about this a little bit, but of course, there's the benefit to donors of being tax deductible. It can be a consistent and reliable source, and there's a benefit to having a broad range, or a broad stakeholder group of folks who are giving individually that can give you a little bit of resiliency. On the other hand, typically smaller donation amounts, and the challenge of managing a donor base consistently. And with you're not likely to have the kind of intimacy with this kind of donor base as you would with big funders who expect a different level of relationship management. A moment on government contracts and grants. I think the key thing to note here is, on the positive side, you really, these can be very large dollar amounts over multiple years, which can offer an organization quite a bit of stability, which of course is so attractive when we're talking about this topic. And if you can get into a government contract that lasts over a period of years, it frees you up to be able to do other kinds of work. And again, just wanting to highlight, I think it bears repeating that the relationship management and reporting and governance overhead here is not trivial. On the con side for government contracts and grants is, you may have, similar to grants in some ways, be really, really careful about both having the financial expertise in-house to manage. Taking public funds is not for the faint of heart. So I think my biggest caution to you on this is, while there's the potential for great financial stability and long-term funding, you really do need folks in-house or at least working for you, who have the ability to manage those funds and do the reporting that's so critical, and align with regulations. One small example of that that I've experienced is, if you have a indirect or overhead rate of a certain amount, then the requirement may be that you have to maintain that consistently across all of your funding all of your grants. So, if you're reporting to the government that you have, your overhead rate is 15%, that's your kind of back office part of the budget, then you may need to stick to that for all of your funding sources. So again, be really careful and aware of the restrictions that you're signing on for, particularly as it may not be limited to just what your government contract or grant is funding, but rather can spill over into requirements for other funding sources as well. So corporate sponsorships, I shared actually made a note to myself here to share the Google AI Accelerator example, because it was a really timely and important contribution to our organization's capabilities and maturity. But beyond that, I think one of the things that can be really powerful is the increase in visibility and credibility. And by the way, that can really go both ways. So I'll give an example here of how credibility and visibility can be mutually reinforcing for both the nonprofit and the corporate sponsor. We're partnered with Workday, the HRIS, and the company produced a documentary called Untapped that was really relevant to our mission. It's all about skills first practices and more inclusive hiring. And that documentary is actually going to be on Netflix starting in a couple of weeks. Our CEO was one of the featured interviewees for that documentary. It was screened at Workday's conference, which was attended by 18,000 people just a couple of weeks ago in Las Vegas. And so for us, it was huge. It was a huge boost to the visibility of the Tear the Paper Ceiling campaign, to our organization, and most importantly, to the mission that we're trying to achieve. Getting that kind of visibility is incredible and is a huge boon to us. And very much, by the way, part of our theory of change, the first stage of which is what we call awareness building. Similarly, I think Workday also, I would, as a matter of opinion, venture to suggest that having a, really earnest, rigorous workforce nonprofit actively operating in the space, not for profit, but for mission, participating in the documentary was of benefit and credibility building for the documentary as well. I think it was a really nice mutual reinforcement of both sides. Again, I will say, as someone who's worked in the private sector and in nonprofits, the thing you've got to be aware of is that strategies and priorities can change pretty dramatically and pretty quickly. I mentioned 2020. That was a time when we got a lot of interest in the workforce space from a wide variety of potential funding streams, particularly on the corporate side, that saw themselves as having a potential role to play in driving particularly racial economic equity at the time. But, corporations, as I say here, can be fickle for any variety of reasons. They can experience what I think of as moments of truth that can all cause uncertainty. So that is one where just being aware of the, leadership change, a reorg, so many things that feel mundane from a large organization perspective can really shift your fortunes if you're overly reliant on corporate sponsorships. I won't belabor this point here, but I pulled this, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a blurry chart. But I linked the broader article here. But the key thing I wanted to share is that, diversification is a great approach to resilience, but there's a limit to it. And what this particular survey showed was that for, in this case, an environmental advocacy set of organizations, they experienced a U-shaped curve. Very small organizations had, experienced a certain amount of funding diversity that shifted over time. And the point was, as your organization grows, you may have shifting needs for diversity. So just wanted to put the caveat as we were having this conversation about various sources of funding, that diversification is great up to a point. I think building resiliency in all manners in your nonprofit is incredibly important, but more for the sake of more is not necessarily better. Again, key point here is to keep in mind that there is overhead, there are choices to be made, and there's expertise, and the broader the set of options and sources of funding that you take on, the more you're going to have to get familiar with those particular funding streams, those stakeholders, the accounting involved, the reporting required, and so on. So just a moment that we'll spend, and then I'll take questions in a couple of minutes, that I wanted to just reflect on the cost side. These are a few categories of things to just keep in your back pocket as you're thinking not only about how do we grow the top line, but also how do we consider our costs, and how do we ensure that our costs and our capability maturity is in line with our organization. So, budgeting and planning, and I'm going to come back to this, but the the headline here is, if there's one thing I wouldn't skimp on, even at the earliest stages of development, it is really your financial management. It is going to stand you in good stead. There are a lot of things that you can probably afford to wait or sequence as your organization grows and matures. From my perspective and what I've observed in the work I've done, this is not a place to cut corners. So really establishing a strong financial planning, budgeting, accounting foundation from the beginning is one bet I would definitely make. Cost cutting sounds a little bit severe, but I would just advise, as you think about where your growth is most likely to move the needle on your mission, really be careful about where bloat can creep in, and where just how much you need to have as a full-time employee or full-time equivalent versus where a fractional opportunity, part-time or contract-based support might be of greater benefit. Pick your rule of thumb, but if you are considering bringing on a full-time employee, think about what's your runway in terms of being able to support that salary fully, or that, the total rewards, the compensation for that individual fully loaded. Would really think about having a point of view, whether it's like, we want to be able to pay for someone for 2 years before we open up a new full-time position or some other timeline, but have a point of view on that. On volunteer and partner management, again, it's not free, it's not entirely free, but where you can leverage volunteers and partners, that can be a real benefit to an organization and can keep costs off the books, particularly when what a volunteer or partner can offer can be relatively self-contained and isn't necessarily one of your genuine core competencies. Other places to, streamline operations include things like technology, and I talked a little bit about service providers and fractional leadership and contractors. So those are all, certainly depends on your particular circumstances, but ways in which to think expansively and pull the pieces of the puzzle together, both on the funding and the cost side of the equation. I'll spend just a minute here, but the reason I wanted to include this final section on unique characteristics of nonprofits is because I really do believe they should be part of your overall calculus for how to create resiliency in your organization and what supports you in doing that. So really quickly, of course, as you all know, on the financial side, there's some really essential advantages like tax-exempt status and tax-deductible contributions, particularly for your donors. On the non-financial side, I gave you that documentary Untapped as an example of credibility that we were able to lend, and ways in which, I've experienced, for example, we've had great access to reporters and press, and we've had to build that credibility as an organization at Opportunity at Work. But having spent more than 20 years on the private sector side, reporters are willing to come to us in a lot of ways because we are seen as a neutral vessel of truth, as being honest brokers, rather than the hesitancy that a reporter might have in talking to someone who is an expert, but in a for-profit enterprise, where there might be a little bit of a, do we want to give free advertising to a for-profit organization? And then finally, not to be underestimated, I certainly, it's not easy working in a small nonprofit. Like I said, what we're doing is really hard. What you're doing is really hard. But what gets me up every day is it's a privilege to do work that has the potential for impact, that gives me a sense of purpose as a professional, especially after building skills in the private sector for a really long time. Being able to apply those skills to an organization that is doing something that I find deeply meaningful is a huge advantage, and I think has helped us recruit great people, broadly speaking. I won't cover this, but you'll have it in the deck. The sense of accountability and governance really stems from understanding how you're going to both understand, measure, and report on your impact, and having, again, thinking that through as part of your set of opportunities and your startup philosophy and theory of change, I think is really critical. It gives you credibility with funders. It gives you hopefully a really clear and clean story to tell when you're pitching folks and when you're both fundraising and just telling your story and advancing your mission. So thinking about this, maybe not the first thing, but sooner rather than later, I think is going to make your life easier in the long run, especially from a funding, gaining and renewing funding perspective. Just a note on boards of directors, they can provide you with tremendous capabilities and opportunities, including expanding your network, bringing expertise in that you might not be able to hire or have otherwise. So things like really deep technical expertise in a variety of ways, and give you great counsel. So this is one of the, I think, unique opportunities for getting support and input that you should think about and evolve over time. So closing thoughts, I did want to just make sure that as you're thinking about your nonprofit and creating one that will stand the test of time and be sustainable, that you have an understanding of, one, what is your market failing that you are looking to address? It's really important to be clear about that, to know then what your theory of change is. So how are you going to address that market failing? And then how you're going to measure that impact. Were you effective? Do you need to pivot? Those three things, I think, are legs of a stool that will give your nonprofit genuine stability, credibility, and longevity. Secondly, and I talked about this a little bit, diversification is a good hedging strategy against uncertainty, but you do pay for it a little bit in terms of complicating financial management and overhead for your organization. So something to keep in mind. And then finally, especially if you accept grant funding, and especially if it's not multi-year, just be aware that your budgeting process needs to be able to withstand volatility that can arise from that funding stream. And I think a lot of nonprofits don't have a lot of running room. So giving consideration to how you build that cushion financially for yourself is really key. And with that, I know we just have a minute left, but I did want to say thank you to Ala once again, and thank you to MTech and to the University of Maryland for this opportunity, and I hope it's been useful.
Thank you so much, Audrey. This has been fantastic. I learned a lot, certainly. I hope that everybody who stayed until the end as well. If anybody has, I think we have time for one quick question. Please type it very quickly in the either chat or Q&A section. And if not, I will circulate Audrey's slides. And I will also send you a link to the video, to the recording once we post it on our Startup PMD YouTube channel. Again, thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you so much to the audiences. I have one quick question. If you have 1 minute, can a for-profit company establish a nonprofit sub?
Yes, as I understand it, but again, definitely not an expert on that. But yes, I've seen that. I have seen that it happen. I do think, again, one of those things that you want to involve a financial planner and a lawyer for sure, because that can be tricky. But there's certainly precedent for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you to everyone who joined, and especially to those who stayed until the very end. Thank you. Have a good day.